We're going to now begin to transition. This is a kind of an evolving organic document, so to speak, into more of the how-to, more of things that are practical applications. They're still concepts, but there's going to be more a sense of a how-to within it and what happens in reality and when you face certain situations and what does that look like. The kinds of things that people have when they ask questions, when they hear this, the how, the what, and when they hear the why, and they start trying to process it, as we just talked about, of the interaction that happens from those that are receiving, from those who are giving. What are the things that pop into people's head that would be either questions or clarifications? And these, in this order, it's not like they're progressive, so these may be random, so to speak. There may be some carryover, but we try to remember, as I said in the start of the class, that a number of these things are going to overlap, and they're reminders, but that's biblical, because even Peter said, I remind you of these things even though you've heard them before. And so I never want to be hesitant to share something that I might have shared all or part before if the sense is it needs to be emphasized, because you get better at what you emphasize and you're more effective at what you focus on. And so when something pops into our head again to say a different way, we never know when the aha moment's going to come. And we don't know in the different ways that people learn if a certain way it's said or a metaphor hits some people and not others. That being said, some of these things have been covered all or in part, but we're going to hit them as we keep thinking as instructors about how to make this more and more practical, so it's more and more something that can be observed and not just talked about, or something that can be done, and we can discuss and interact about what it looked like when we saw it and what it looked like when we did it. And the first one then is how do we make competing biblically sustainable? How do you make it reproducible? What does that mean? What does that look like? If I'm a parent, if I'm a fan, if I'm a coach, if I'm a player that's going to transition out of playing days to the end of playing days, because most of your life in most sports you play only in the early years, and then you may, some sports, not play them again. Other sports, are life sports that you can play until you're very old. And so regardless of whatever the sport that you're doing, at some point you're going to transition from from playing to more spectating. So how do we make this philosophy, given the sport, again, whether it's professional, college, high school, junior high, or youth? If we had categories like that, I guess you could say after professional, we could go adult sports or those kind of lifetime sports, which also are a platform for teaching competing biblically. Because if I'm an old guy, which I am, and I'm playing tennis or pickleball or I'm golfing, I get a chance to examine myself and my philosophy of how I approach that golf game or that tennis game or that bridge game or cards. I mean, all these competitive situations allow for the way to think about and process it to advance the kingdom or use for the kingdom. I really feel that way, whether it's cards or golf. It isn't just those competitive sports that we consider young people do. It's any kind of competition when it's two or more people that are, in a sense, working in a contest way where there's competition. How do we want to approach it to use it, to leverage it for the kingdom or advance it? We really are thinking this is possible. I know as I play golf, I'm playing against myself, but I also have my sons or others that are there, and we're scoring, and we're aware of it. And so you have opportunities anytime there's any kind of scoreboard, any kind of awareness that somebody's ahead and somebody's not ahead, there's an opportunity for challenge to your flesh, for advancing the kingdom, to try to use it to practice the principles and evidence the freedom that comes in Jesus in the midst of competition. And so back to the question, how do we make competing biblically sustainable and reproducible? The reminder, the takeaway, or the thing that has to be the thought is this is transformational. It's a transformational philosophy that goes beyond the contest to life if it is practiced appropriately in the way the Holy Spirit, we believe, desires. Because all of these contests are in some way relational, there is a playing out of it, and generally words are involved, meaning language in the contest. Unless you're doing an individual sport, at some point it's relational. There's relationships that are involved. There's words or speech that's involved. We're trying to have a philosophy that's as simple and practical as possible, so even children can manifest the tools to play free Obviously, fear of failure and fear is a tremendous debilitator in the competition, contest kind of world, sport we're calling it. And so when people can play or live free of fear, they have a much greater chance to close the gap between their performance and their potential and feel the pleasure to enjoy the trip and the process and trust the outcomes to God. We talk about Bible verses. If we had to find a verse that links with this thinking, it's the horse is made ready for battle, but victory rests in the Lord. It's not dissimilar to one plants and one waters, but God makes it grow. These all have to do with process and outcome, and that's how we think about this philosophy. And so it's a transformative philosophy. Relationships are involved. Words are often involved. We're trying to make it as simple as possible so that it can be sustainable and reproducible. Sustainable means it lasts. Sustainable means I can practice the philosophy as a 4-year-old and a 40-year-old and an 84-year-old. That I can practice the philosophy in any culture, in any language, in any sequence of years, from the 1800s to the 2000s to the 400s or in the time of Christ. All these things we want to make sure are sustainable. They'll last. They're reproducible. They can multiply as people play them and live them out. So how can we make them that way? By making them more relational. Because at some point, I am sharing something or I'm doing something that somebody is observing or I'm talking about, and then they're doing it, and I'm observing or supervising them, and we're talking about it. That's the interactive piece. And then at some point, it has a chance to reproduce. At some point, it moves from that particular time and place to another future time and place, depending, frankly, on the degree that the communicator, whether he's communicating with his mouth, information only, or whether he's communicating by his play, his physical articulation, whether that's playing cards or playing football, as it moves from talking about and interacting to actually watching it or doing it. If it is relational, it is. If it's oral, it can be communicated with words and with actions. If it's simple, then it increases the chance that it's sustainable and reproducible. It's reproducible. The principles are reproducible that moves to the point of reproduction. And when you reproduce reproducers, when you reproduce a philosophy to and through others who reproduce the philosophy, then it can last forever in a hypothetical model, and that's where we're working from. So, as an example, if a coach is walking in this philosophy of competition and another coach observes it, either a coach on that staff or another coach, if a player, I can tell you a story of a player who was on an opposing team to a team that was practicing this philosophy. This philosophy was being practiced by a team. The opposite world's philosophy was practiced by another team. They were in a contest. It happened to be that on the other team, in the non-Jesus driven philosophy, which was all about winning and trying to beat somebody and kill somebody and dominate somebody, he, as a Jesus person, watched the way the opponent was playing and how they interacted to them as opponents, to referees, and to each other. And he said to himself, this is a true story. I won't give the name just because I don't want to. But in his observing it, he said, I want to play on that team. He actually transferred schools and joined this team. So he started his career over here, and he ended it over here because he observed it being in the midst of competition, and his spirit engaged that he wanted to be about that. He wanted that process. He wanted that outcome. I'm not talking the outcome of the scoreboard. I'm talking about the outcome of enjoying a trip and having transformational impact beyond that little 2 or 3 hour contest. That'd be an example of players seeing it, observing it, players watching other people do it, players then hearing about it and then saying, in my play, if they can, I'm going to practice that. Or when I'm done playing, whether I become a coach of youth sports or a coach who's a teacher or a professional coach that's doing it for a living and that's all he does, all these ways that it becomes transferable because it's transformative, because it's relational, because it's communicated orally and in action, because it's simple to articulate. I mean, it's difficult. We say it this way. It's simple. It's not easy. It's not easy because you're going to have to die to yourself. It's simple because We can describe it in simple terms. How you treat the scoreboard, how you treat the opponent, how you treat the referee. I could give you a simple explanation of the philosophy. You may not get how it works because you're just hearing it, but I could simply articulate it in a way then we could process and interact about it. And then when you see it, which is what we try to do in this philosophy, as we play around the country, our teams play, we encourage people to go to the game and see if they can tell the difference. Because if somebody is filled with the Spirit versus just being born again, you can tell the difference between those two people. And if a team is playing by this philosophy versus the world's philosophy and you watch them play, you can tell the difference. It is observable and obvious if you're close to the action that you can see what's going, how they treat, again, each other, the referees, the opponent, the scoreboard, the postgame, the pregame, all interactions with the fans. You can see it. It's visibly observable when it's practiced in a form approximating purity philosophically. And so coaches can communicate this with coaches. Coaches can communicate it with players. Players can communicate it with players. When they go to the next, when somebody's a player in this kind of philosophy, and he goes into in a secular setting, in a sport context, he can approximate it as appropriate. We're going to talk about that later. If he gets into business, he can use the principles for his business. He can use it for his family. And so players then reproduce this philosophy in their future lives, whether they're sport or otherwise. Coaches can reproduce this philosophy with other coaches when they stay in their profession, or because it goes cross-sport, a coach in one sport can communicate it to a coach in a completely different sport. It crosses gender, it crosses sport, it crosses time zones, it crosses cultures, it crosses everything. That's the beauty of it. That's how it becomes sustainable and reproducible, because it can be transplanted in Burundi today, or in the Ukraine today, or in Honduras today, and it could do it 100 years ago or 100 years in the future. The philosophy will work, and it's shared player to player, coach to player, coach to coach, fan to player, player to fan. In every way, anybody touched by it can then move the ball forward in their verbal articulation and practice. It's transferable in and outside of the sport.